is another reading from Paul Knitter. We're reading the preface in chapter 1 from his book called, very provocatively, Without Buddha I Could Not Be a Christian. So this is available on e-reserves. It's different than the other book from Knitter that we've read. It's much more personal. You remember that in the preface to the first book that we read by Knitter, he says that he's intentionally kind of holding back on his own perspective. He considers it to be a success if you're not sure by the end of the book which model he himself subscribes to. This book is much more personal. It was written several years after the first one, and he kind of lets us into his own personal struggle with Christianity, struggle with Christian doctrine. And he talks about his sort of journey into, and then he would say back out of Buddhism to some extent, not out of Buddhism, but he would say through Buddhism to come to a new and deeper understanding of Christianity. So he really, throughout the book, especially in some of the chapters that we're not reading, is kind of pushing the boundaries of Christian theology, and yet he is striving to do theology that is indeed still Christian. That's his explicit goal in the book. It's a really interesting project, and I'm very curious to hear about your responses to it, because my sense is that we have these kind of mixed reactions when we read it. It's a bit confessional in that he's confessing, which takes a lot of courage to do if you're a renowned scholar like Knitter. He's confessing the struggles that he's had over the years, and he's documenting the way in which the deeper that he's come to understand Buddhism, the more that he feels like he can then come back to Christianity. So this leads us to our forum post this week, which is directly based upon these two chapters from Knitter's book, Without Buddha I Could Not Be a Christian. And essentially, I'm just curious, what do you make of the project that he's undertaking in this sort of personal journey of his that he shares? The question that we're essentially getting at in the forum post is, can there be such a thing as Buddhist Christianity, which is what he's trying to pioneer and what he would sort of claim for himself. So can there be such a thing, and why or why not? So again, really pushing towards your reactions and responses to what Knitter is sharing in this book. In some ways, this gets at the heart of the distinctives of Buddhism. Recall, there's a debate about whether or not Buddhism is even properly a religion. It doesn't have a specific theology about God or a creator, or it's more of a worldview in that way, which is one of the reasons that it's so conducive to be kind of folded into Christianity in the way that Knitter has done it. So that's the forum post this week. Again, directly responding to the Knitter reading that we're doing from the e-reserves. Let me just briefly say something about the other resources this week. You have a simple handout on the Eightfold Noble Path, which is a breakdown of Buddhist spirituality. You've come across this in the readings already, but this is just a nice presentation to help us understand what the Eightfold Noble Path is and how it fits into the larger worldview and spirituality of Buddhism. And then finally, you have another TED Talk this week from Matthew Ricard. And the topic of the TED Talk is basically on mind training and happiness in Buddhism from a Buddhist perspective. So let me tell you a little bit about him, a little bit of what I want you to listen for in the TED Talk and how it relates to the rest of the material this week. Matthew Ricard is French. He grew up in sort of prestigious French intellectual circles. He became a molecular biologist and got his PhD under a very famous scientist. And then pretty quickly, he sort of gave up that whole pursuit, and he became a Buddhist monk in Tibet. And he's also an author and photographer. So he's written a number of books. One of them is on the subject of happiness. And he shows some of his own photographs in the TED Talk, and they're really remarkable photographs. There's been a lot of commentary on his photography about the way in which his spirituality and his photography are almost one and the same, and you get a little sense of that in the TED Talk itself. He's also very involved with humanitarian work and charity projects. He gets at that a little bit at the very end of the TED Talk. Most of the proceeds of his books go to humanitarian causes. There's something amazingly serene about him that I think causes us to pause even before we consider what he's actually saying. There's something about his demeanor And I think it's fair to say that that is a quality that is not uncommon within those who practice Buddhism, and particularly Buddhist monks. So as you watch the TED Talk, I want you to consider a few things. First of all, think about the middle way, right? This kind of touchstone of Buddhism that is navigating between the extremes of asceticism on one hand, total denial of any sort of pleasure or luxury, and indulgence on the other hand. So in what Ricard is saying, there's this sort of appreciation for beauty, for goodness. It's not total self-denial, right? It's very stringent religious spiritual discipline, but it's not total asceticism. So I want us to understand what the middle way looks like in practice, and I think Ricard gives us a good sense of that. There's also, we can see the way in which Buddhism, there's kind of this rejection of class distinctions. Think about Buddhism's reaction to Hinduism's caste system. So Ricard himself came from a very prestigious background, these philosophical French circles, PhD. He seems to have risen above all of these things, and yet he still draws from his scientific background, right? In the very end of the TED Talk, he gets into sort of some of his scientific reflections on Buddhism and Buddhist meditation. So he hasn't completely broken off from that, but it's almost as though those aren't the things that matter to him anymore, this prestigious doctorate and the world that he lived in as a molecular biologist. So you see this disregard for those kind of class and status distinctions. He draws a distinction between happiness and pleasure, right? So this kind of also comes back to the middle way. He's not looking for pleasure, or within Buddhism, that the goal is not pleasure, which is sort of dependent upon circumstances or the objects of our delight. The happiness that he's talking about is something much deeper than that. So he uses a number of analogies. One of the analogies he uses is the ocean, right? In the middle of the ocean, on the surface, you have these very tumultuous, crazy, overpowering waves and kind of unrest, but deep down in the depths, there's this kind of peaceful solitude, silence, and so he uses that as an analogy for happiness, for this, what he wants to call the antidote to all emotions in Buddhism. It's going below the rocky, unstable surface and discovering this sort of abiding peacefulness that comes from within. Okay, so that's one of the ways that he describes happiness from a Buddhist context. He talks about consciousness using the image of a mirror, right? A mirror reflects all kinds of things, but it's not itself affected by what it reflects, right? The mirror remains unchanged. So again, think about the connection to Buddhist spirituality, that we can't necessarily control the circumstances in our lives, but the goal is to in some sense not rise above them in the sense of detach from them, right? Buddhists are very involved with the happenings of the world, but there's this goal not to be kind of tossed about this way and that way by whatever happens to be going on in one's life. So this all brings him to his discussion of mind training, which sounds kind of new agey and strange, but think about it in the context of what he's talking about. The goal is that the idea is that we cannot experience two emotions simultaneously, both anger and joy, for example. And so the idea is to literally train our minds to cultivate a particular disposition. Okay, and that's what Buddhist meditation, that's part of what Buddhist meditation is doing. Again, think about the Eightfold Noble Path and the goals of the path. So again, I think that I want you to think about the TED Talk in line with what Knitter is arguing, and ultimately I want you to consider, is the kind of happiness that Ricard is talking about in the TED Talk compatible with Christianity? Is there a way to say, yes, it fits within a Christian worldview and an understanding of the Christian gospel to seek happiness in the way that Ricard describes it? So I want us to really push on this kind of interreligious theology question this week, which is the compatibility of a Buddhist worldview and framework with a Christian worldview and framework. Recall that a few weeks ago we asked the question with regard to Hinduism's path to liberation, paths to liberation. We asked, what can Christian discipleship learn from Hinduism in this regard? Remember, we talked a little bit about Dallas Willard's book, The Spirit of the Disciplines, in light of Hinduism's view of this path towards liberation, towards freedom. And this is a slightly different question that we're asking this week. We're not simply asking what can Christianity or what can Christian practice learn from another religion, but can we in some sense fuse the worldview and practices of another religion, in this case Buddhism, into our Christian discipleship, as Knitter has done. So again, the question we asked with Hinduism was sort of the two religions standing side by side and saying, can one learn from the other? What Knitter's trying to do is really integrate the two in a way that we haven't really talked about until now. And again, this reminds us of the distinctive nature of Buddhism, which is that it doesn't have these theological tenets that might be very problematic for a Christian to employ. Think about Hinduism, right? It would be very difficult, I think, for a Christian to really embrace Hindu theology and stay within the Christian camp. Now, you might ultimately conclude that about Buddhism as well, but I want us to understand that it's a slightly different question that we're asking because of the nature of Buddhism. So again, thinking about Knitter's claim and what Knitter's trying to do in the book that we're reading from this week. So in any case, that's our engagement with Buddhism this week. Next